Today's session is titled Design and Consumerism in Modern Japan, and we'll be joined by Ian Lynam and Nomiyama Sakura. Lynam works at the intersection of graphic design, design education, and design research. He is part of the faculty of Temple University, Japan, as well as at the Vermont College of Fine Arts in the MFA in graphic design program, and also is a visiting critic at the CalArts. He operates the Tokyo design studio Ian Lynam Design, working across multiple disciplines, including identity, typography, and interior design. In discussion today with Lynam is Nomiyama Sakura. Nomiyama is a design researcher, writer, and curator who earned her MA in the History of Design and Curatorial Studies at the Parsons School of Design in New York in 2016. She is a researcher at the National Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo, and also a part-time lecturer at Joshibi University of Art and Design and Tohoku University of Art and Design. Today's session will first actually begin with a presentation from Ian that examines the intricate relationships between business and design from an economics and cultural perspective, particularly through the work of, I would say maybe the practice or the field of graphic design, although I do know graphic design as a term may or may not be complicated by Ian and Sakura later in discussion. The presentation format will begin with Ian once again, and then followed by discussion held together with Sakura. I'm very much excited to hear about how you both take on the making of the Japanese consumer. So thank you, Ian and Sakura, for joining today, and thank you for all our attendees to join again, particularly those who had to make this rescheduled time slot. So without further ado, I would like to pass the time over to Ian.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bruce. That's really great. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll dive right in. So hopefully that is visible to everyone. So the way that we structured this presentation is that basically, so the lecture is called Design and Consumerism of Modern Japan. And the way we structured it is that we're going to make some stops along the way for Sakura and I to discuss certain images in order to help contextualize what we're talking about today, as well as the objects being discussed. So, yeah. So let's dive in. So this is Mitsukoshi Limited, or Kabushiki Gaisha Mitsukoshi. It's an international department store chain with headquarters in Tokyo. Mitsukoshi is one of the symbolic tentpoles of telling one story of modernity in Japan after the country reopened to the world after the Meiji Restoration. I say, quote, one story, unquote, as all histories are authored, and this story I'm telling today represents a singular perspective, my own as a foreign graphic designer, design historian, and design critic based in Japan. Mitsukoshi started as a Tokyo-based kimono retailer named Echigoya, and it later incorporated under the name Mitsukoshi Dry Goods. At that point, it became a department store that was a leading early force in marketing and creating consumer goods. The company's strategy was triumvirate. First, to accumulate many types of appealing products under one roof. Number two, to openly display them. And third, to engage in outward-facing cultural activities in order to appeal to the buying public. So basically, creating events to draw people into their department stores. Mitsukoshi sells a mix of both domestic and foreign products, and it was one of the first Japanese businesses to feature glass-fronted showcases to highlight their wares, as well as one of the very first retailers that added glass windows to the facades of their shops to further promote their stock in 1903. The first to do this, however, was the Kyoto branch of Takashimaya department stores, which unveiled a glass facade in 1896. While seemingly simple, these actions invited the gaze of potential customers and led to actually quite staggering sales figures. These new aspects of sales to the public were explored in this specialized trade magazine, or Senmon Zashi, called the Show Window Gaho, or in English, the Show Window. It was launched in 1915 by the publisher Senima Kenji. And it was basically helmed by a revolving cast of editors, including Masuda Heikichi, Sasaki Juku, and Ariyama Konosuke. Here we have the debut issue of the magazine, and it really specialized in highlighting approaches to window display, to then current sign painting techniques, assorted poster advertising, but also novelty design formats, such as the quote, poster stamp, unquote, which were really small multicolor promotional stamps. They weren't used for postage, but they were just like little, basically mini posters that are stamp size. So kind of a cool thing. The magazine featured award-winning department store and specialty store window displays with captions and interviews with commercial artists and individuals working in advertising. One thing that I found very fascinating about this magazine is that the show window featured English captions alongside the Japanese captions as well. And there was a focus on many different regions of Japan, functioning as a chronicle of new approaches to retail display advertising. The editorial staff presented conceptual approaches to advertising that considered things like representation, abstraction, composition, and negative space, as well as offering some design criticism. For example, in the second issue of the show window, there was an evaluation of the work of Japanese artist and designer Hashiguchi Goyo. And they basically compared Hashiguchi's work to the work of British illustrator Aubrey Beardsley. So quite fascinating in that way, really, trying to, figure out who was the quote, better designer at that time. The magazine included progressive approaches to the lettering and typography of that time, and considering really typographic arrangement of characters was just as important as the quality of characters' design. So as they looked at it in this magazine. The show window was really outward looking. It featured illustrated essays on poster art from England and Germany. And yeah, it wasn't just show windows, lots and lots of different types of commercial art at that time. The magazine was renamed in 1917, becoming the Window Times. So here we see an issue that reflects that name change. The cover is on the left. On the right, we have a couple examples of basically show card designs showing basically flora and fauna. Over the 24 issues of the magazine that were published from 1915 to 1918, the show window and the Window Times presented cutting-edge approaches to advertising and analyzed stylistic trends as much as the psychological effects of advertising on Japanese consumers. So quite fascinating in that way. So let's go back to Mitsukoshi, talk about Mitsukoshi a bit. Mitsukoshi offered its own lines of seasonal kimono fabrics starting in 1895 that were created by both hired artists and designers, as well as in-house staff. And it really created a demand for clothing designed by the company in lieu of just merely selling other manufacturers' products. Mitsukoshi launched its own public relations magazine in 1899 to further attract attention, and it was the company was the owner of Japan's very first delivery van, emblazoned with a corporate logo in 1903. Mitsukoshi's management insisted on constant iteration and expansion. By 1922, the main store boasted 50 different departments over 6 floors with, as we see here, a rooftop sky garden replete with pond, fountain, shrubs, and bonsai. The company's strategic marketing and public relations were leaders at the start of the century in Japan. And Mitsukoshi's posters and billboards created resounding notice throughout the country. They were led by Japan's very first graphic design superstar, shown here, Sugiura Hisui. He was hired by Mitsukoshi in 1910 and really just used a wide array of advertising methods to attract consumers of all stripes to buy ready-made affordable kimono and rewarded them with lavish experiences at Mitsukoshi locations that can largely still be enjoyed today. Department stores in Japan include a mix of fine dining, cafes, semi-public spaces, and exhibition spaces, as well as retail offerings, all catering to shoppers to induce them to part with more of their hard-earned money. Sugiura's work for Mitsukoshi was incredibly popular, including posters advertising the department store that updated the ukiyo-e woodblock printing theme of the what's called bijin-ga. Bijin means beautiful woman, ga meaning image, or depictions of beautiful women. One of Sugiura's most well-known posters, shown here from 1916, depicts a beautiful woman perusing Mitsukoshi's own Sugiura-designed promotional magazine, the Mitsukoshi Times. She's clad in sumptuous decorative kimono, and that's just juxtaposed with then-contemporary Art Nouveau interiors. It's worth considering this earlier poster, designed by an artist and designer I mentioned earlier, named Hashiguchi Goyo. Hashiguchi had entered a poster competition held by the Mitsukoshi department store in 1911, and he won out over 300 other entrants, earning a whopping 1,000 yen in prize money, which was kind of a lot back at that time. The poster is a lavish painting of a woman in a formal kimono, lounging on a decorative Art Nouveau chaise lounge, and perusing a book of ukiyo-e prints. And this was really quite important. This poster is another example of the bijinga, or depictions of beautiful women theme. But literally here we have the bijin, or beautiful woman, holding ukiyo-e prints in her hands that are rendered in the style of ukiyo-e. So the flattened form of representation in Japanese painting and printmaking that has a very, you see the foreground and the background. There's very rarely any form of midground. However, so that's what she's holding in her hands, yet she herself is rendered in the Western tradition of painting, honoring history as much as representing it in the style of that day. And Hashiguchi's deft depiction of the evolution of tradition brought him a lot of acclaim. So I thought that this would be a great place to stop and chat with Sakura about these two posters together. So there's an exhibition of Sugiura Hisui's work on right now in Tokyo at the Tobacco and Salt Museum. And it shows these two posters together. Sakura, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about these together.
Can you see me?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Well, I haven't visited the museum yet, but I know those works because they are very famous. Yeah, I think I want to point out the most iconic differences is that the Hisui's work is more imaginary. Like, it's very flat, but also when you look at the female figure, it doesn't look real at all. But on the other hand, Goyo's poster, you look this beautiful woman, and she looks like a real, like a very not realistic sort of depiction of the female figure, and that's really I think interesting to look at because Hisui, when he was working as a designer for the Mitsukoshi department store, the department store was actually working to create taste. The taste doesn't mean like anything concrete, but more fluid idea of taste. So it was working for like something imaginary. So it was very, very important for him to create that something really imaginary, but that attract people's attention. So I think the interesting sort of differences in these two pictures, like especially for me, like, okay, so the history is working something to create new, But on the other hand, Hashiguchi was like more into the sort of tradition, as you pointed out, like Japanese style painting, like, but sort of try to do something cutting edge a little bit.
No,
what do you think of it?
No, that sounds great. I just wonder, like the posters are in some ways like so similar, I've never read anything about, what management thought at that time. It's just interesting, this idea of like, just a few years later, hey, make almost the same poster, but in your style.
It was like more like challenging for Hisui, maybe, I don't know. But the interesting thing is that right after he created this poster, the Hisui created another poster for different company, but he used the same sort of composition and elements too, but using different letters for different companies. So I think this compositional elements were very popular, commonplace among these sort of designers.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you. I don't know. Yeah, it's just like, it's something that I've always wondered about. So it's great to have a chat about it.
Yeah, but also interesting, like maybe the style, like these are example of Art Nouveau, like especially the, well, I think Hashiguchi, well, it's like 5 years earlier than Hisui's, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so like, it's still like something like imported from abroad, like sort of copied some elements. And yeah, but also you can see some like a Japanese painting kind of flower depiction too in the background. So like it's sort of mix of these two different styles. But the Hisui, I think he tried to sort of use total different idea of sort of Zuan, the design. Maybe he studied a lot from like, magazines or books he had.
Yeah, just how flat it is. It's really awesome. Awesome. Thank
More
you.
advanced. Yep.
All right, so we'll keep moving on. So Hisui's work designing posters, advertisements, and these advertorial magazines for Mitsukoshi, alongside his kimono fabric service designs, targeted both male and female consumers alike through Art Nouveau and Art Deco infused illustration work, expressive lettering, and aspirational imagery that suggested the creation of a light-filled de la mode dream world through the consumption of Mitsukoshi's products, of course. Design departments at Mitsukoshi and its rival company, Takashimaya. Mitsukoshi's opened in 1909, Takashimaya's in 1912, and each provided promotional advertising with really streamlined visual messaging. There was an economy of form and a real directness in regard to consumer appeal that can really only be described as modern, largely free from ornamentation, the visual frippery of earlier times, and featured a lot of like really direct to the point advertising copy. Here we have another, this is a cover of the Mitsukoshi Times magazine. So the impact of Hisui's designs for Mitsukoshi were so powerful to the public that the department store was said to be, quote, Hisui's Mitsukoshi, and the designer was called Mitsukoshi's Hisui. So a little bit about Sugiura Hisui. He was born in Matsuyama City in Ehime Prefecture in 1876, and he moved to Tokyo in 1897. He graduated from Tokyo School of Fine Arts, or the Tokyo Bijutsu Gakko, in 1901, having studied Nihonga, or the Japanese style of painting, alongside a bit of what was called Yoga, or Western style painting at the time as well. So with Japan opening to the world, just basically like a lot of new terminology was created to help kind of define traditional Japanese forms of culture versus Western forms of culture, or Western or foreign forms of culture. So these words, Nihonga for Japanese painting and Yoga for Western painting, were some of these terms that were invented. Sugiura was a favored pupil of the painter and arts educator Kuroda Seiki, shown here. Kuroda-san had traveled extensively through Europe in 1900, and his student Sugiura was just enraptured with Kuroda's collection of European ephemera that his teacher had collected on that 1900 trip. Sugiura would become an obsessive collector of visual materials over his career, amassing scores of reference books and self-created thematic scrapbooks dedicated to animals, insects, nature, lettering, and other themes. I thought this might be another good place to stop and chat with Sakura about Sugiura's penchant for collecting, Sakura was one of the researchers and curators involved with putting together an amazing landmark exhibition called Sugiura Hisui Image Collector in 2019.
Yeah.
Tell us what you find out.
Well, his daughter, well, he didn't really have a daughter, but he had adopted a daughter, and then that lady, she gifted a big, like, yeah, she donated us like big things, and that's like part of it. So it took so long time for the museum, the National Museum of Modern Art Tokyo, to go through all of the materials. And the last two, well, the exhibition was in 2019, I think. So it took like 2 years to go through all of the materials. And then we found out that some of the images are so similar to the output Sugiura created. And we thought it would be really nice to compare the image, the source image, with the actual output he produced. So we went through all of the materials and sort of specify or find out that how he categorized all of the materials, because he was so neat. He filed all of them like and labeled them like dog or cat or like, you know, plants, and it was quite similar the way he edited his Zuan book too, because he published a lot of design image books, and then that was also edited accordingly, like the cat or dog, or like depending on like what subject it is. So yeah, and then I thought it would be really interesting to sort of point at those aspects that he created, and also the how he collected the images and how he created out of those images.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's another thing, is like he recycled a lot of imagery as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think so. It was really hard for a lot of designers like Zanka to create something new, I think. Like especially for Hisui, I think he was a true painter. He loved painting, and he believed that he can develop, like people can develop design skills from drawing a lot. That's what his philosophy of design education. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's why like he drew a lot, and he actually made a lot of them out of his drawings too. So yeah, I think that's something like actual artists were essential for him to produce, like, yeah, posters or flyers like in a short time.
Yeah, totally. And also as a teacher, you know, later on when he started teaching, he was very insistent that his students draw a lot.
Yeah. And I think the Tama Art University, like that he was the founder of the university, but he insisted that designers should draw. So a lot of designers who graduated from the Tama Art University actually drew a lot during university students' time, I think.
Yeah, he would assign, like, I think it was like over the summer, they had to do like 200 botanical sketches, but like very detailed. So it's kind of a taskmaster. Cool. All right. So after Sugiura graduated from school, he worked briefly as a designer for a printing business in Osaka. He tried his hand at teaching junior high school in Shimane Prefecture, but that didn't seem to satisfy him. And he returned to Tokyo to work as a designer for the newspaper Tokyo Chuo Shimbun. Sugiura's relationship with Mitsukoshi began in 1908 when he was hired as a freelance designer by this man, the executive director and senior managing director of Mitsukoshi, Hibi Osuke. Sugiura was hired to design and illustrate hybrid magazine / catalog covers for the magazine, which we've seen a few copies of already, the Mitsukoshi Times. So I think it's really important to note that, you know, Mitsukoshi started out as a kimono shop that really catered to the powerful and affluent. But under Hibi's guidance, Mitsukoshi became one of Tokyo's leading department stores, really serving Tokyo's upper classes alongside the upper middle class that emerged during the Meiji era. Working under Hibi, Sugiura was elevated to the position of chief manager of the newly formed Mitsukoshi Design Department in 1910. His monthly duties expanded in 1911 to include designing and illustrating a number of other projects for Mitsukoshi, not just the magazines, but posters and loads of other promotional materials. Hisui held an exhibition of his own work. The name translates into Publication, Book, Magazine, Cover, Design, Exhibition at the Hibiya Library in 1912. And in this exhibition, he showed off over 200 examples of his publication design works, spanning catalogs, magazines, and book designs, many, many, many of them for Mitsukoshi. The works featured different printing techniques that were actually kind of atypical for that time in Japan. From printing on cotton board to the use of metallic foils to the use of lacquers in the printing process. The exhibition, as shown here, was hung salon style with framed individual cover designs mixed with these looming overhead boards pasted over with multiple designs. The exhibition was offset by a glass-faced display case, which we see at the bottom left, showcasing his more kind of like upmarket book designs and publication designs, as well as we see in the foreground a plain table kind of heaped with Hisui designed publications. So this is just a couple years into his career, and he's like making a lot of stuff. Beyond publication design, Sugiura was also a prolific designer of posters for Mitsukoshi, as well as later for freelance clients, such as the Calpis Corporation. Basically, they manufacture yogurt-based soft drinks. He started working for them in 1921. Here we have some wrapping paper for larger sized bottles of Calpis that he designed. Calpis is still sold with decorated wrapping paper today. And this dot theme that is here, so basically Calpis is a fizzy drink, and like that's where that's where this design theme comes from. So it's a rendering of bubbles, basically. And variations of the packaging today still include the dot patterns. So I think that's really great because it's an echo of Sugiura-san's design decisions, you know, informed by the drink's effervescent bubbles back in the 1920s. And it's just nice that those bubbles are still floating around today. Hisui utilized both illustration and photo collage when necessary to connect viewers with the appropriate visual message for a client, often returning to the themes of the feminine and of nature. These themes would extend into designs for tourism as well. From 1913, Hisui started designing a magazine called The Tourist, shown here on the right, which was a promotional English language travel magazine for the Japan Tourist Bureau, as well as a wide range of promotional postcard designs, form-rich posters, and books targeting foreign tourists. In 1921, Sugiura-san became a lecturer in the Tokyo School of Arts Zwan department. So this is a term that Sakura has brought up a couple times, and we're gonna break that down a little bit. So, but before that, basically starting in 1922, Sugiura-san traveled through Western Europe for about 2 years, collecting materials for inspiration and taking in the European aesthetic sensibilities of the day. So Zwan. It should be noted that this term Zwan was more commonly used when referring to what we now know as graphic design at that time. Before the widespread adoption of the loan term graphic design or graphic design, the Japanese language had earlier terms for the processes that map to a Western idea of design, and one of them was Zwan. Zwan refers to the actual execution of a design. So imagine, you know, pencils hitting paper with the use of rulers and geometric aids to create lettering and patterns. But there was another term as well called koan. So koan is the mental and intellectual articulation of a concept to be executed. So I think this is like a quite fascinating thing. Like the conceptual process, the thinking part, and the making process were split apart etymologically at that time. So due to the time period in which this word zwan was popularized, many historians kind of conflate the term with early Japanese commercial arts that integrated an Art Nouveau aesthetic, though the term in use was actually far more wide-ranging than just period aesthetics. So yeah, so when we're talking about zwan, we're talking about design, and that's just the old school Japanese word for it. So before and after his travels in Europe, Hisui's designs incorporated elements of European Art Deco and secessionist influence, as much as drawing on the Japanese legacy of printmaking in terms of influence. So he's really kind of pulling from multiple inspirations, movements, and sources. Once he returned to Japan, he formed a design study group called the Shichi Ninja, or the Group of Seven, which is often abbreviated as SNS. So if we look at the bottom right of this magazine cover, you'll see there's a little triangle with a little band that says SNS. So that's indicating that this publication was created by the Shichi Ninja, or Group of Seven. So the members of the Shichi Ninja included Arai Izumi, Kubo Yoshihiro, Suyama Hiroshi, Koike Iwao, Hara Michiharu, Kishi Hideo, and Nomura Noboru, so alongside Sugiura-san. So this group of 7 people were very interested in critically studying design. And this really kind of helped define the rest of Sugiura's career. The group started this magazine called Affiche, which means posters in French. And it debuted in 1927, and it was published through 1930. So here we see the cover of the first issue. It's around A3 in terms of size. It's quite a big publication. The debut issue it starts off with a kind of like a statement of intent or a working manifesto, but it had some really fascinating stuff in it. So these are taxonomies, basically visual lists of commercial signage studies on the right, and basically firefighters' insignia that were collected and drawn by Sugiura's colleague, Kon Wajiro, who we're going to hear a bit more about later. Really fascinating researcher working in Japan at that time, and a professor at Waseda University. So earlier I was talking about poster stamps. So this first issue of Affiche magazine also featured one page that was perforated and featured multicolored Affiche decorative stamp designs. So pretty cool that like poster stamps were included in the mix. So if we look at Japan around that time, basically, or Tokyo around that time, avant-garde and design books from outside of Japan were easily available, starting in the 1920s all the way through 1938. Most notably in Tokyo from a bookshop, a German-themed bookshop called Kaiser, based in Kanda, and the nearby book retailer Sanseido. Each stocked this magazine. It's a renowned German design periodical called Gebrauchsgrafik, alongside an array of exhibition catalogs and photography annuals from around the world. Soviet art and design publications were also available. There was and still is today a shop called Naoka, which is based in Tokyo's renowned bookselling district called Jinbocho. So you can still go and see where folks were getting their materials back in the day. The influence of European and Russian design publications on Sugiura was immense, leading him to contribute regularly to this design journal created by an editor named Hamada Masuji. This journal is called the Shogyo Kendai Shogyo Bijutsu Zenchu, or translated into English as The Complete Commercial Artist. So it was published by a publishing company called ARS, A-R-S, starting in 1927. It was published in both hardcover and softcover editions until 1930. And it was one of Japan's most important interdisciplinary design publications at that time. It provided domestic audiences with surveys of commercial art and design in all of its forms from both Japan and the rest of the world. Overseas and domestic applications of design trends and theories were cataloged within. The title of this journal also heralded an etymological or word-based shift in what the practice that we now call quote, graphic design, would come to be called by practitioners and the general public alike at that time. So a new term had popped up around that time, shogyo bijutsu, quite literally commercial art. And this became the next step in terms of definition and how practitioners and the public would define this sector of cultural production. So this term shogyo bijutsu was really popular, and it was in popular usage until the early 1950s, when it was replaced briefly by a term shogyo design, meaning commercial design. That became popular for a little bit, and then post-war, there was the widespread adoption of graphic design in around the early to mid 1950s, and that continues through today. So individual volumes of this magazine focused on one or more disciplines, including poster design, advertising, package design, shop signs, billboards, flyers and broadsides, page layout, typography, and many other related subjects. And it's a very beautiful magazine. It was produced in 24 issues. It was subscription only. You couldn't buy it in shops. It had substantial explanatory text. It was profusely illustrated, beautifully printed, and had loads of color plates reproduced within. Each of the 24 issues featured comparative graphic surveys from abroad and within Japan, extensive studies and sketches of architectural ornament, surveys of things like wrapping paper, and in-depth analyses of signage. The very final issue, issue number 24, was a 100-page essay by the editor Hamada-san, dedicated to an examination of commercial art as an expression of the time. So, and a lot of people kind of consider issue 24 of this magazine, the Gendai Shogyo Bijutsu Zenchu, to really be one of Japan's very first pieces of graphic design theory. So incredibly important. And all this stuff really, really motivated Sugiura-san. He wrote this in a book a number of years later. Design does not signify anything other than practicality. The inevitable desires that come up in our daily lives seem to be this way no matter the time in which we are living. Modern people must create living ways of design that transcend modern utilitarianism. This was obvious to the decorative arts and industrial arts of yore. There is a simultaneous evolution in many fields of design, especially in the modern commercial arts, which are growing at a quickening pace. Sugiura's commercial practice continued to flourish through the late 1920s. He designed this poster, the only subway in the East, celebrating the Tokyo Metro Ginza line opening to traffic in 1927. He also took on a number of book design projects and continued with his work for Mitsukoshi. His association with Mitsukoshi also gave him the opportunity to design what are called omoshiro gara. So in Japanese, omoshiroi means interesting or novel, and then gara means patterns. So omoshiro gara means basically novelty fabrics. So he was designing a certain amount of novelty kimono fabrics and a large number of decorative obi or kimono sashes. So a lot of designs for those. And many of the graphic themes that were found in Sugiura's posters would be echoed, redrawn, or adapted in these surface designs. They're very, very, very collectible today if you can find them. One of the most rare pieces of Hisui's work is this on the right. It's a child's kimono vest bearing the very same characters and composition as made famous in his poster, The Only Subway in the East. However, I think it's fascinating because the whole scene has been re-rendered from a less foreshortened perspective, and this is an incredibly rare kimono. Kimono jacket. The lone example remains in the collection of one of Tokyo's most renowned and elusive collectors of kimono, whose name has been withheld by request, but I was lucky to be able to photograph this. And I'd like to stop here to speak with Sakura about Hisui's insistence upon recycling many of his designs and the visual themes within his work over his lifetime.
Recycling. Well, this kimono is really interesting example of how sort of he used it, but also he rendered a little bit, to fit into this kimono dimension. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's always like a sense of like his intention that he tried to use it, but try to produce in a different way, like a manner, to respect some extent, I think. So, but well, maybe because of I think the poster was really popular because this is like a one of the first posters for the Tokyo's metro, the subway. So it was probably popular among the public. It was very iconic for many people. So it was probably not his idea, but also like, the Mitsukoshi's idea to use it like as a kimono pattern. That's quite, I think, possible for sure, I think.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I think there's another thing about this kimono design on the right. You'll notice that I mean, and I'm sure you know this, Sakura, but like basically like when you make a kimono, you basically print like giant rolls of fabric, and like we see that there's this row of people, but then they're flipped upside down below. So this was created in a way so that like when the fabric was cut to actually sew the kimono together, it actually didn't matter which way was up because design's going both directions.
Right. Very practical. So he thought about that. I don't know whether he actually applied that design to the kimono, but maybe there is another department that actually worked on that kind of things. But yeah, but considering the article you picked up, that the history was very conscious of like practicality. Yeah, and the idea, Western idea of design. So it was, I think it is really possible that he actually thought about that.
Yeah, definitely. What was like when you were doing the research for the exhibition? Were there certain motifs that you saw kind of recycled again and again?
Yeah. Like he loved birds.
Yeah.
So especially there's some specific like types of like birds that he really loved. So he photographed a lot of them. Like he went to Ueno Zoo to look at the actual animals, and he photographs of them, and then he picked up some of the best shots and he kept using it, but in different manners. So yeah, there's some respect to some extent, I think.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, so moving on. Sugiura was a prolific magazine cover designer as well. I mean, he created hundreds of covers for assorted publications throughout his career. He designed the covers for the Tokyo Central Telephone Directory in 1933 and 1934, as well as neighboring Yokohama's telephone directory in 1934. And he designed a few dozen book covers and spine designs as well that are really, really fascinating and beautiful. He also designed a lot of packaging designs. So like these are the covers, not covers, what's it called? Packaging for cigarettes. So it's a cigarette brand called Hikari. And he designed, so like there was Hikari, another one called Hibiki, Minori, Momoyama, and Fusue as well. So loads and loads of work for the tobacco industry. He also created the label designs for a bunch of different lacquer, varnish, and paint compounds manufactured by Hitachi Chemical as well. So I think that's the thing, like I mentioned all this different stuff because he had like a very wide-ranging career in regard to commercial design. So pretty fascinating. He was invited to become the head of the craft pattern faculty at the Imperial Art School in 1929, and he stayed through 1935. But he wound up resigning after kind of locking horns with that school's administration. And the previous year, he'd also resigned from Mitsukoshi. He had a lot more free time. So in order to respond to that free time, he was one of the co-founders of the Tama Imperial Art School, today's Tama Art University, so Tamabi, in 1935. And he brought a variety of really established educators on board, including Arai Izumi and Koike Iwao from his group, Shichi Ninja, as well as younger teachers like Kimura Kazuichi. The faculty held its first exhibition the following year. And they also launched this great publication called Deseguno. So Deseguno is a word in Esperanto, so the fabricated language. And Deseguno is the Esperanto word for design. So the magazine was a journal of design theory published from 1936 until 1939. At that point, basically, Deseguno was kind of absorbed into Tama University's house magazine called Tama Art in 1939 and ceased being a standalone publication at that time. I think that it's interesting to note that one of the premier art universities in Japan was co-founded by a graphic designer, not a fine artist. Myself, being raised, I'm from New York originally, and in the 1980s and 1990s, the notion of a graphic designer was that of a failed artist. So I think it's pretty fascinating that Sugiura-san, was one of the founders of one of Japan's most reputable art universities. And I don't know, he did a lot of work with that university. He first became the president while continuing to work as a teaching faculty member. And he later became the chairman of the board of trustees of the university until 1963. And those around Sugiura-san exhibited an exceptional sense of solidarity, especially among the faculty throughout the years, including on the left, short-lived faculty member in terms of his time at Tama Art University named Satomi Munetsugu, one of the most successful designers in Japan, who also, he lived in France and in many other countries for a number of years, as well as on the right, Yamana Ayao, who would lead the design faculty at Tama Art University after the end of World War II, both incredibly famous and reputable designers of their time and dedicated educators. Yet it's the design of the countless volumes of the Sugiura designed Mitsukoshi Times, Mitsukoshi's hybrid magazine and catalog designed before the war, which kind of illustrate the effectiveness of consumer appeal practiced by Sugiura and his team, and which led to Mitsukoshi's dominance as a center for cultural and commercial relevance. So the Mitsukoshi Times regularly featured small swatches, as shown here, of the latest fabrics available to consumers for kimono and Western clothing alike, each cut by hand and into small squares and individually pasted into the publication's layouts. This action of transcending the printed page and including the literal material products being offered in lieu of, yet also beside photographic reproductions, really increased the allure of what the department store had on offer. They would show you pictures, but they would actually show you the real thing so you could touch it and feel it. And it really increased people's desires to purchase Mitsukoshi distributed goods. Mitsukoshi accumulated further cultural capital by setting up galleries within their retail environments, displaying and selling works by leading artists at that time. And they hybridized department stores, making them palaces of culture as much as places of buying and selling. These actions, combined with promotional tactics, such as adopting cutting-edge technology. Here we see the installation of the very first escalator in Japan in Mitsukoshi's Nihonbashi location in 1914. Stuff like this, by having the very first escalator, it really kind of consolidated the department store's cultural, social, and aesthetic authority. Just in terms of really truly making taste, like Sakura talked about earlier. Mitsukoshi and its many imitators led the way in which cosmopolitan material culture would manifest itself in regard to shaping middle-class consumer aspirations, as much as how that might mold conceptions of men and women in bourgeois society. It must be noted that department stores were equally important to men as well. It wasn't just women. This on the right here, we see an image of the cultural researcher Kon Wajiro that I mentioned earlier. And he undertook studies of Tokyo department stores in the 1920s and 1930s. And he found that up to 50% of shoppers in Ginza in assorted stores in 1928 were male. And there's little doubt that the display of commodities in department stores was just as important in shaping cultural notions of the modern man as much as the modern woman. It's against this cultural and aesthetic backdrop that we can get a sense of the dawn of the modern Japanese consumer. and the cultural distortion field surrounding them in regard to romanticized and nostalgic images in contemporary media. Marketing, publishing, and public relations as translated through graphic design were as resident in changing conceptions of consumers to consumers as much as of consumers to the greater society. So with that, we've come to the end of the presentation. Thank you all very, 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 very much for your time. Appreciate that. And let's stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Oh, there's a question.
Oh.
Well, not the question, but the comment. Sugiura will be good at using Pinterest.
Masato Nakada. It's funny.
What do you think of it? I don't know. It's really hard to answer this question because it's different situation and condition. So, and I think that gaining the images or having new ideas from overseas are very, very essential for designers back then. Like it was one of the requirements for them to be like that. So I think it's people from the rich family tend to be designers, that's for sure, because they had the access to a lot of different materials from overseas. And Kurodaseki, that the guy Ian introduced, he was also a rich guy too. So, and he was the very center of the design, like design education at the university. So,
yeah, totally.
Yeah,
I think, yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so like we looked briefly at Munetsugu Satomi's work, and Satomi's work is fascinating to me because like throughout his career, like so much of his stuff like looked like kind of an almost direct copy of the work of the French poster artist A.M. Cousin. And like, but I love Satomi's work just, you know, for what it is, but like how he rendered ships, that was really a big thing. I'll type those names in the chat so people can see what I'm talking about. Sakura, were there any other, I don't know, interesting things that you learned about Sugiura Hisui during your time working on that exhibition?
Well, so I wanted to bring the issue of copyright because as you sort of brought up, recycling images or using the existing images for like certain projects was very common thing back then, like in 1920s or earlier, or even after 1920s. Like maybe, yeah, the copying was one of the political issues that Japanese designers were facing. So yeah, that is the thing like I wanted to talk about, but I didn't have a chance to do that. But also I wanted to talk about education too, because the Masuda-san, that the Masuji Hamada, so the guy who, well, it's probably he was the first person who started using the term commercial art, shogyo bijutsu. He is one of the early examples. So he started using that term in 1920s, and then he promoted the idea of commercial art. But that actually has a term, the art, right?
Right.
So like he didn't really use the term Zuan at all. He wanted to sort of make a connection with art, like fine art. So in that sense, I think that Hamada or Sugiura were trying to struggling to sort of establish the idea of Zuan as the sort of part of art practice.
Yeah.
Rather than like design, or something like more independent practice. So that was very interesting for me. Then in 1950s, like people started doing talking about the independence of design and try to be apart from departure from that idea of commercial art, but moving to the idea of design or graphic design.
Right. No, that's very true. I've got a little bit of text here written by Hamada Masuji. He wrote, commercial art has emerged from the disintegration of art and the aestheticization of commerce. I've previously discussed the style and aesthetics of commercial art. Now, what about its development? Since commercial art is art with a purpose, it pertains to pragmatically useful activities. But is that all? The reason commercial art constitutes a new and definitive art is that it has fully united the actual form of commerce, which is not commercialism, as in its true form, commerce is simply distribution to many people. With the newly conceived form of production art, commercial art becomes productive and simultaneously resists power when it merges commerce and production art and moves toward spiritual elevation. Commercial art is art that is truly useful society for the very first time, and the power of art manifests itself to society for the very first time. I love that. Like the thing is, like, that dude, like, he was crazy. Like, he was like super into it. No, he wasn't crazy. He was very, very, very intelligent, but he was just really into it because, I mean, he studied commercial art and then became, you know, a publisher and then an educator and a lecturer and started his own school. But that he saw it as being this force that could change society, but also connect us with spirituality. It's beautiful. It's amazing. So.
Yeah, so I think that the spirituality is very important when we think about art, like, you know, because like that's like something like we cannot really talk like, or that's sort of beyond that our what like practicality or anything like that. That's something that nothing to do with the actual society, but like something happening in our mental.
Yeah.
Like for sake of like, you know, whatever, like one's creation or imagination. So yeah, the very good quote, I think.
Yeah. I've got a question for you, Sakura. Like, how did you, so like being a design historian, that's kind of a rare thing. How did you become interested in this?
I actually practiced as a graphic designer when I was a student, but I didn't really like making things for commercial. And that's one of the reasons why I stopped doing it. But I loved it. I loved looking at, or I loved creating something that maybe in a different way. That's what I thought when I was younger. So I got the bachelor degrees in graphic design, but decided not to pursue that, you know, career, and shifted my career to more like a curatorial serialization of design, because I had some issues that when I was talking about design, like, or my own creation, like it's going back to the copyright or copying kind of things. But like when you talk about what you create, like whether it's original or something that copied from something else, like it's really hard to sort of explain sometimes. Like even you don't really know where the influence come from, like if you never thought about it. But by learning design history, you can actually look at the things surrounding you and what, like where they come from and how they influence me in a sort of yeah, like at some point. I don't know. But that's the thing, like I wanted to find a way, like reasons to understand my own creativity in that sense. Yeah, and I'm learning, like still learning actually. So maybe in the future I want to be designer. Maybe I don't know, at some point, but for now I'm happy with my career. So
no, it's interesting, you know, like to become a design historian is it's a rare move.
It's a rare move. It's a very rare move in Japan. I think it is.
Yeah, no, I think it's awesome. I mean, I don't know.
You
know, I love it. So
but I think it's really essential for, like, especially nowadays, because we like the students in Japan need to have more, I don't know, the design history education. Like they are not really a well, design education is always more about creating things, like using applications, that sort of thing. They're not really focusing on that sort of theory or history at all. Like they study it, but still there's some hierarchy between practice and then studying on desks. Or it's, yeah, but I think it's really important to think about and use our mentor to sort of vocalize what we, like, you know, what design means to us.
Yeah, totally. I agree. And then also, like, you know, just history is super important, because how are you going to create something new if you don't know things that are old? And it's I don't know. Like Sakura, I also teach design history, and it's super duper important. So it looks like we have a question in the chat.
Yes, we do.
From Masato Nakada. It sounds like it was quite common for designers to recycle graphics. Tadanori Yoko often had his own library of graphics. Were they trying to establish their own graphic voice and market that?
Well, I think what Yoko does is more tactic that he used. Like, well, he practiced as a graphic designer. When he was a designer, he didn't really make things like what he does right now. Very much old-fashioned graphic designer back then. And then he started his career as an illustrator. He sort of started using his own graphic words, and appropriation was like part of it, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
The market that, well, still there is a market for that though. I mean, like Tadanori, like Yoko is the Wormsy and probably the first examples, like, who started doing that kind of thing in Japan in like a pop culture context. So, but maybe not for people, like younger people.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just pulling up an image that I can share with everyone so they can see what we're talking about. So just one moment. Where is it? Here it is. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen again. Take a look at this thing. So, Sakura, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that.
All right. So this is Yoko-san's, breakout poster from a group exhibition called Persona, held in 1965 at the Matsuya department store in Tokyo's upscale Ginza shopping district. The poster is titled "Made in Japan, Tadanori Yoko. Having reached a climax at the age of 29, I was dead." It was a mix. It was really a mix of messages from the person who was the youngest participant in this group exhibition in 1965. So we've got a lot of stuff going on here. But one of the big things was the use of appropriation. So like, he's using this rising sun motif, which is pulled directly from old advertising and packaging design. So that's like a really big thing that he would do again and again and again. I always say that this is, like, in my opinion, one of the first pieces of postmodern graphic design in Japan, because there is a certain amount of complexity and hybridity and things that we tend to associate with postmodernism going on. And also the fact that it's announcing the designer, not a product that's out in the world, and also announcing his own suicide is really quite fascinating. Then also, we have things like there are two Mount Fujis in the upper left and right-hand corners. One has a Shinkansen bullet train speeding by, whereas the other one, you can't tell, is it erupting or is it being bombed? And I think that Yoko is being very, 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 very deliberate with this. And it's the kind of thing, he would do stuff like this, and he would recycle a lot of imagery. And Sakura mentioned appropriation. So if we look at the poster here on the left, there is this giant peach that's pulled directly from old matchbook packaging designs. So it's something like, he would really, collect a lot of imagery and deploy other people's imagery. So yeah, and he's definitely, like, to kind of piggyback on what Sakura was saying, like he's had different phases of his career, like shifting from like more designer to designer and illustrator, and then now to artist. So
step by step.
Pretty much. I like the first step personally. That was my favorite, but I don't know. So I'm a traditionalist like that.
But I think it's really your point is really interesting because by illustrating himself like on the poster, he became product to be publicized. Also, there is elements are also products of pop culture too. So yeah, there is he was really conscious of using those visual languages. Without that, it doesn't make sense at all, anything, like doesn't have any value or sense of value for him, I think. So it's a different sort of level of appropriation compared to the Sugiura's or other earlier designers.
Yeah, definitely. But also that Yoko today is so conscious of that. So like, I don't know, it was like maybe like 15 years ago, maybe longer, maybe 20 years ago, he did this like remix project where he took Alexander Rodchenko's work and motifs from his own work and like mixed them together to make this new artist that like both of them. And he's very self-aware of motifs in his work that are popular, and in kind of packaging that and selling that back to the public as well. So yeah. So I'm wondering if it looks like not so many questions. So what do you think, Bruce? Do you have any?
Allow me to step in because I've got a question. I was really enjoying this idea you both brought up about practicality. And I really, I'm not too familiar with Sakura, your exhibition, but this idea of the image maker and collector is interesting. What I mean, what interests me about practicality, it just seemed like it was the natural thing to do, to be collecting things at the time, to have this kind of like archival paradigm shift in the practice of being a designer, which I think is very fascinating. And I almost feel like it marks the beginning of, like, it's also very global in that sense, because it's like the emergence of designers being very aware of other influences beyond one's own borders. So I actually want to ask you both, because you both have a background in practicing design, and you're both kind of designers turned design historians, also still practicing to some extent. I just want to hear a little bit about if you feel like this kind of practicality or this shift at that time almost necessitated the field of design history and design theory to emerge, or maybe you could also both speak about what the idea of critique or theory was like prior to sort of Hisui's time.
Well, practicality is very essential for like emergence of the idea of design in Japan, I think. It's really like to position it as an independent sort of a field of study or category of art or creation. Practicality is something different from art, fine art, pure art. So that was a very important idea. And then like later on, like in 1950s or 60s, designers start saying like design is like something like it's good for society, or yeah, it's like related to society. So it's really important. That's something that started like I think Harvard Beer said that in the World Design Conference in 1960s. Yeah. So that was very influential, I think. And then people start saying that the social responsibility of designers.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's like really super fascinating. Like, so I studied graphic design both on an undergraduate and graduate level in America. And the first big book about about graphic design history is called The History of Graphic Design by Philip Meigs. It was published in the 1980s. However, Japanese graphic designers were recording their history 20 years before, notably the writing of Yamana Ayao, who I mentioned. He wrote a book called basically Design as Experience. And like, it's, yeah, I think like that's I don't know, it's just like always fascinating to me. Like, you know, like, yeah, it's about practicality, but it's also just about kind of intellectual interest, and also how that's expressed through cultural output. So for example, I showed the Yoko Tadanori poster from 1965. I would argue, you know, like Japan postmodernized earlier than the West as well in terms of certain approaches to design work. So that poster would be an example of really something really impractical, but
Right.
the world is so much better for it being in the world.
Yeah. I mean, this idea of practicality just really, like the image of Hisui's kimono, that metro
kimono,
design
yeah.
turned into a kimono is just so ingraining, you know? It's so beautiful, and then just so smart how he, with the foreshadowing, turned it into a textile design.
Right.
Like his back and forth with textiles and with patterns all over prints, I think pretty great.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing. It's like, I wish in this presentation I could have included more textiles, but obtaining rights to those images is tough. So, and like,
well, his obi design, like his designs for the obi, the sash, also are very amazing. Now that he knows a lot of some techniques of like, not printing, but it's like textile, like weaving. So too, like I don't know how deep he knew, but he was conscious of like how he can sort of effectively produce a pattern for the such a simple, you know, the structure that obi. Also, there's also his I think his idea of like how he can like sort of for production, like he knew a lot of like how he could save much money for like production, and then like there's always knowledge of the I think production side of kimono or obi, I think.
Yeah, totally. So go ahead.
Yeah, we do have a question there, but just to piggyback right onto that, I have a question about this these lovely omoshiro gara that Hisui worked on. I want to know if you could share how that was received at the time, like if Hisui was not sort of backed by Mitsukoshi, what sort of role did those designs have? Like, were they accepted, or were they accepted because they were endorsed by this huge department store, or how did those come about?
I mean, I'm sure, you know, having, you know, Mitsukoshi having your back is gonna like really increase the popularity of your designs. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, like it's pretty fascinating in terms of like who those designs were actually intended for. So that's a child's jacket. So like omoshiro gara were often made for children, and that was a big thing. So, and it was about the power of the parent as consumer more than necessary, because like if you're a little kid, like, you know, I mean, it's only like that big. It's for like, I don't know, maybe like a 5-year-old. Like the kid's not gonna be like, no, I want the Prada one, you know. So like, I think
well, that's actually a good point, because we looked at the images of the rooftop of the buildings, right? And there were actually lots of toys for kids. So the kids were part of consumers, I think. And then, you know, to attract their attention, they put those toys on the rooftop, and while they're playing with them, like, you know, parents can go like, you know, downstairs to do shopping. So there's like a combination of like, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah,
kids
looking-
and
And they had
killings.
childcare staff as well. So you could like,
Oh yeah, right. Also, they had like a musical group,
Mhm.
like they the kids play too. So like the kids are so like the center of the, I think, consumerism back then.
Oh,
Well,
interesting.
still, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that rooftop picture actually makes me think about how maybe it's the first time that like any creative practitioner had to manage so many expectations. Like that mall is just that department store is pretty intense of an experience, I think.
Yeah, I that's the thing that like really still to this day, I'm so impressed with department stores in Japan because I mean, they are these like liminal spaces. They're both private and public. And like, I don't know, like you can just sit, I don't know, on an overstuffed easy chair with a beautiful view of the city and you can just take a nap. I think that's like a really, it's really cool. I don't know, it's not just people trying to buy and sell you things, but there are places for potential rest as well.
True. So like taste making is not really about like can mean that consumers like sort of making taste for consumers, but also like educate people for good reasons, you know, to sort of bring the level of the people in Japan.
So interesting education.
From
When look into Sakura, your exhibition, I think you said that mentioned that. So I'll go back to the audience's question. So I'll read this, maybe I'll just read it out loud word for word so our interpreter could also interpret it. Are there contemporary designers whose works shows a direct knowledge and influence from these design traditions, or has Instagram/Pinterest broken that chain? I'll quickly follow up. This person also says, maybe I worded the question wrong. I mean, do you see social media as something that has broken threads to a past design tradition?
I think it's difficult because the thing is like, you know, things like Pinterest, basically image aggregation websites, tend to, you know, people feel like they can get a shortcut to like historical influence. So people see, you know, JPEGs of historical output, but they don't really think about the contexts a lot of the time of, you know, why things look the way they did. And they tend to just kind of deploy historical aesthetics because it's cool, you know, and like there's often very little kind of semantic thinking behind it. Like, why would you use this particular thing, especially in the Japanese context? That can be a tough thing because like most arts institutions that have design departments tend to not focus on certain semiotic terms like connotation and denotation. Denotation is literally what we see, and connotation is what it makes us think of. And when you start removing this analysis of aesthetics, it can be really, really problematic. So yeah, there are contemporary designers whose works show a direct knowledge and influence. So for example, Kobayashi Ikki, he worked at Shiseido. He's very intimately familiar with historical forms. Also, what's his name? I'm spacing out on the dude's name. I'll look it up. One moment, sorry. Oh yeah, I got it. Ohara Daijiro. Like he's someone who uses different aesthetics from different periods, but I'm pretty sure that Ohara-san is very aware of why he's doing what he's doing. So I don't know, Sakura, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, in terms of like act of collecting, it's nothing like different from like, you know, what Sugiura as a designer did, but I think the context is more complex now. We have to think about a lot of different issues behind images, like as Ian brought up. For example, like we have to think about genders and also what like nationality, a lot of different things is going on because like this globalism. And then so it's okay to collect images from the websites or like Pinterest or whatever, like Instagrams, but always keep attention to where they are from and how they were used and what other people think about that. Like otherwise, it's really pointless of like referring to those images because those images may are not really as suitable for what you are looking for in the context. Maybe just for visual, I don't know, like just to look at. It's okay, but it's always like concluded with like a final product. So I think it's always keep in mind that we need to look at the things with always a context,
I think also like image aggregation and like kind of reuse is something that people have been doing for a really long time. It's not just since the emergence of Pinterest. And like, again, like kind of to echo what Sakura was saying, like, how are you using them? And like, why are you using them? So for example, there's a very popular British design group called the Designers Republic. Made a whole career out of making Orientalist design. And no one has ever kind of like dug into that in terms of, how potentially offensive some of that work might be. Yet it was also championed in the Japanese design press, particularly, they were kind of like the darlings of Idea magazine in the early 2000s. So, I don't know. Yeah. I don't think anything's broken. It's just society and culture is changing. And we're just seeing reflections of that.
So there's also a kind of a comparative question not in the chat box, it's in the Q&A box, just so you know. It says practicality equals speed. Do you think the Japanese designers, I suppose, were on tight deadlines at all times compared to the Western designers?
Well, when we think about like rationality, it's something that's the right word to say that. But still, also, I think the speed is really something that we need to consider. Ian knows a lot, maybe.
Well, I think, it's hard because I haven't read any documentation of like how much time Sugiura had to turn projects around. But the thing is so if we look a little bit further back in terms of Japanese design history, the very first type foundry operating in Japan was the Tokyo Tsukiji type foundry. That after it was founded, a guy named Hirano-san became kind of the de facto manager of that. Before he became the general manager, there were workers were allowed to have a siesta, like they were allowed to have a little nap in the middle of the day. They weren't worried about the rate of production so much. But Hirano-san showed up and just he was like, all right, no more naps. If you don't meet your production quota, you're fired. Like just really thinking in this way that was like a manager. And I think that's something in terms of speed, efficiency, efficacy, like all those things are super duper important in Japan and in the West at that point. Though we don't know exactly how quickly things had to be turned around, I'm sure everything was done on a pretty tight deadline, because that's still how design is today in most countries. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question a little bit.
Yeah, I really, I personally really enjoyed the context given within Ian, your presentation. I particularly like how you started actually your presentation about this is one story. I like that idea that in graphic design, in a kind of this I don't know what to say. It's a discipline, it's a field. Graphic design, I think, has a lot of, canon figures and ways that we're used to, narratives that we're used to. So it's been very enlightening for me to listen to the presentation very much. I just maybe one final question from myself personally is, when you both as designers turned design historians enter an image, what are you looking for? I know that in this presentation, for example, we're looking at a lot of context, a lot of alternative ways to consider how graphic design has cast influence on other aspects of life. But I'd like to see, personally, maybe what got you to this point. How do you enter an image now? How has it changed? Or how do you wish other people would enter an image of Hisui's, for example?
I think for me, I don't know, just in terms of outlook and disposition, I would very much consider myself a postmodern designer. One thing, just, in terms of, one thing I really believe is that more is more. I think that less is more is not the case. I do this really fun project with my undergrad students where we do it a bunch of different times throughout assorted semesters, and it's a way of evaluating work. So that this idea of how you might enter an image. Basically, we'll look at a piece of design that's very reductive. So for example, there's a quite famous t-shirt that says John and Paul and Ringo and George that was designed by the Dutch design group Experimental Jet Set. So I asked my students if this, so basically bathrooms with toilets in Japan tend to be very small. So you have a toilet and then you have a door right in front of you. And I will ask my students, if you had this John and Paul and Ringo and George poster as a poster form and hung right in front of you, how long, if you're in this confined space, how long can you sit with that image before you get bored with it? And most of them say they get bored very quickly. Then I'll show them some work that is more postmodern, that is more complex and has a lot of contradiction or ambiguity. Or, for example, the work of Sugiura Hisui, when we looked at that original Mitsukoshi poster, where there's just so much decoration and ornamentation. I would ask them, how long could you sit with that instead? And the thing is, when there is more there, you literally can spend more time with it. So that, in terms of my own personal subjective way of analyzing and viewing images, yeah, complexity, contradiction, ornamentation, all that stuff is incredibly important to me. So. Sakura's just smiling. She's avoiding the question.
Well, I don't really create image, so my point of view is not really something like that Ian just said. Well, I think what training eyes is really important for me, like for my students too, like to look at like how they look at things. And always we need an image to look at if we want to sort of train that inner sense. So yeah, I don't know whether I'm answering properly, but it's like, can I answer like in a yes and or no kind of answer? I don't know. I never thought about thinking that way. Sorry.
Yeah, just to think about like how like the way I would, I actually come from, a textile background, for example. So, when I look at the images, I'm very much gravitated towards the, the depictions of textiles, for example. But then, Ian also brought up that interesting case of the swatch book. So those are the things that I gravitate towards, so for example, in my case, it's actually, when you talk about textiles, it's easily about trade and the market. So I just, so when I look at the images, the visuals that were just shown just now, it became very easy for me to actually associate with the idea of consumerism. Whereas I'm just thinking about how, in your ways, you might influence your students, for example, to actually see that if they don't come from sort of that kind of a background.
Yeah, well, it's really essential because I use a lot of objects, but not like I don't really use the image, but I use objects, actual object to look at things. So in that sense, yeah, it's really essential because like a simple glass can be, understood in different levels. So like as a material, as a form, or so breaking down to the elements, like visual elements of the individual thing, object, and then talk about it little by little, and in the end reaching a certain goal, like depending on what kind of purpose we have. But when you look at things, like you have a certain purpose to understand or to appreciate, or depending on that, you change your way of looking at things, right? So that's I don't know, I'm answering right. I don't know. But that's what I use image in my practice.
I think that's another thing, like the idea of like the Japanese notion of mono no aware, like that perhaps we could have a relationship with objects. I feel that way.
Yeah. Clothing, yeah, that's right. Relationship with object is something like we have a code of object too. So
totally.
Yeah.
So there's one last question that just slipped in just in time. So maybe we'll just take a look. It says, do you think there's a benefit for designers today to build a design archive or library in similar practice as was done before digitalization?
Well, actually, I'm making an archive now for one of the designers from 70s, 80s. And I think it's really essential, like especially like it's very similar to what I just said, but those objects are sort of evidence of the past, and it's not about the fact of the past, but also like what was going on back then, what material was popular back then, like what kind of people were working back then, that sort of thing. It's objects are evidence of it. And digital cannot go beyond that actual object sometimes. Well, maybe in the future possible, but so I think it's really necessary to have a physical archive of the designers or product designers for some extent. Like it's not really like realistic to think about like all the designers, but if we can save some of them, yes, it's very important.
I think the thing too is like, so in the question, do you think there's a benefit for designers today to build a design archive? So I think that's super important actually in terms of like this whole idea of different stories. So I believe the first time that I met Sakura was at an exhibition that we both participated in called Fragments of Graphism, which was an exhibition that was put together about the history of Japanese graphic design, but it was put together by different designers, not historians. And in particular, I can't remember the dude's name. There was one person who was kind of looking at outsider culture and
oh yeah, that
it was like the scum design stuff. It was like
scum design guy. Yes,
yeah,
it's a designer for Popeye too, right?
Yeah. So like, just like this idea of like, actual designers creating histories, not just leaving it to the historians. That's actually to me something that's super duper important, because the thing is, it shows an active interest, and the thing is, there are so many other stories that could potentially be told.
And that method was really interesting too, because they didn't really bring the actual objects, but they use all the images from the laptop, like the computer's screen. So basically they printed out all the images from the computers and they just pasted on the paper to make their own sort of history board. So that was a really interesting way to look at history from their own perspectives.
Yeah. I think like one thing that is also important to note is that we're in a moment where the notion of decolonization of design and design history has become very prominent and very important. And having, being able to emphasize, different perspectives is incredibly, incredibly important. Like there's always something problematic with just wholeheartedly accepting a canon, a canonical history of design, because or any history. So, because there's just so much more there. So it can be a very personal thing, a very political thing, but it can be a really beautiful thing too.
Yeah, this multitude and this beginning of this idea of historicizing oneself as the designers did in that exhibition. And just, this presentation, for example, is just one story, as Ian, you mentioned. Thank you both for joining the discussion today. It was very lovely to just be in the presence of such beautiful visuals that really just set the stage and contextualize the research that both of you are pursuing. And we really look forward to how that evolves over the exhibition, towards the exhibition. And just to remember, this is just one story. So we're expecting a multitude from various researchers throughout.